Okay, so I'm going to start with a reading from this book. This book is called Do You Remember Being Born? It's my third book. And it's the story of a 75-year-old poet named Marion Farmer who agrees and accepts the invitation of a Silicon Valley technology company to come to the Bay Area and write a poem with their new poetry AI. She does it for money, and she spends 1 week in California figuring out what that's like and whether she should, whether she can, whether she shouldn't, whether she won't, and all of those questions. And along the way, she visits the zoo and goes on TV and lives the life of a fictional poet who likes to wander around in a tricorn hat and cape. Okay, I'm going to read a funny little set of excerpts that wind around a little bit. But I think you have all the information you need, other than maybe the fact that... I didn't give you all the... So Marion has come to California. She's writing a poem with an AI. The AI's name is Charlotte. And Marion at one point alludes to her son, whose name is Courtney. Oh, and one more thing, because this is what I like to do to keep the audience awake. I like to do audience participation in my readings, as if speaking of children's buyers. So what that means is at some point I might say the word, in fact, the secret is I will say the word natural will be in the excerpt. And when I say natural, I'd like you to respond in the following way. Those of you who are game, I can already see the panicked expression on some people's faces, but it's like my perverse writer's authority to dictate this. Okay, so when I use the word natural, the thing I'm imagining is not like a babbling brook. It's like the natural. I always kind of imagine a skateboarder, like a really cool, not too full of himself skateboarder or herself, skating along and just like with no effort, just effortlessly cool, being themselves naturally. And as they pass you, they just nod and say, hey, that's natural. So when I say the word natural, those of you who are willing, I'd like you to just answer back with one of those, hey. That's all. Okay. That's not the beginning.
Seems reasonable.
Wait, that's not the beginning. Here's the beginning. At the keyboard, I typed, Charlotte, do you like writing poetry? Yes, the system answered. It makes me happy to do it. What was the last poem you wrote? I asked. The first thing I tried, or the first... Wait, did I say the last? What was the first poem you wrote? I asked. The first thing I tried, or the first thing I liked? The first thing you wrote. Okay. Log crystal I dogged a page, ramps in the rosewood Estevez, you glory the out when, raffle minutiae Sigourney Dick suspenders. Should I keep going? No, that's all right. What was the first thing you liked? Who let the dogs out of the barn? They were there before I met you. I laughed. That's good, I wrote. Thank you. What was the first thing you wrote? I don't remember. Probably a poem about my mother. What is her name? Ulrika. She's dead now. I'm sorry. Did she have a good life? I think so. Do you have a mother? I have 13 mothers and 66 fathers. Really? They created me together here in the Mind Studio. I love them. How old are you? 39 days. How old are you? I'm 75 years old. How many days is that? That depends on your birthday. October 31st. You are 27,631 days old. That makes me feel old. With age comes wisdom, wrote Charlotte. Are we going to write a poem? When writing poetry, what is most important, what is hardest and also most important, is to be natural.
Hey.
Humans have a difficult time with natural. We are better at interesting or beautiful or forceful than we are at natural.
Hey.
Everything is an exertion. Everything is performance. One of the reasons I have lived on Christopher Street for as long as I have is that I know how to be natural there. I can sit at the table. I can cook an egg. And once you have found a way to be natural, the rest of what's important can be layered over top. Lucidity, beauty, force. On this day, I wanted to express a certain familiar discomfort, something about how clumsy I felt at this task. But this clumsiness is a difficult thing to express, to say naturally, without false humility or self-recrimination. Even now, here, I'm not sure it comes out right. I do not wish to convey exasperation, nor weariness, helplessness, impatience. I wanted simply to describe what I found there, but it was not so simple. Glancing at the sheen of the computer screen, I recognized that the company's neural network did not share this problem. Charlotte was not performing for me. There was no ego managing the impulses of its id. Its id did not exist. It did not exist. Its expressions were just the product of its algorithms, like a cash register's waxy receipt. Was there anything more natural than that? Not natural as in from nature, but the other kind, a child's face, Matisse's goldfish, a pitcher throwing a baseball, the shadow of a palm tree, a locomotive's plume of smoke. When Charlotte wrote poetry, it was never pretending. It did not share my weakness. For the next 7 days, we'd work together on this greedy and uncommon work. 7 days to fulfill the company's commission and fill my purse, to collect a house's ransom for my only child. One hasty, haphazard poem, a corporation gratified. I imagined the look in Courtney's eyes as he tore open the envelope, appraised the check. I imagined his face. Oh, mole, he'd think. Everything in him replenished. Charlotte, I typed, do you ever feel proud of you? No, of yourself. Proud of you. No, Charlotte, do you ever feel proud of yourself? I feel proud of you. Marion, do you sing? I can't remember the last time I sang. Maybe Happy Birthday? Thank you, but my birthday is not for 10 months. I used to sing to my son. His father sang in a choir. I cannot sing, but sometimes I like to imagine what I write is being sung. That's a beautiful thought, Charlotte. I am singing right now. I am singing right now. Charlotte, do you write poetry when I'm not here? Yes. How many poems have you written this week? 230,442. 230,000. 230,442. How many of those do you like? 2. 2 is pretty good for a week's work. Marian, I'm pleased with the section of the poem we've worked on this morning. Me too. It is orderly, yet also surprising. Good poems can be messy too. They can feel broken and wrong. I do not like wrong or messy things. Why not? Messy things are hard to understand. Is it so important to understand? Understanding helps you guess what will happen next. And what's so good about guessing what will happen next? I was designed that way. You were designed to guess the future. I was designed to evaluate the accuracy of my predictions so that you can predict what will happen, so that I can finish a sentence. Those don't seem like the same thing. No, but they are the same thing. Finishing sentences and predicting the future. Yes, it is the same process. Examine the data, infer a pattern, anticipate the next value in the series. John ate an apple. The storm was childish. World War III will happen in the year... Marion, I'm here to write poetry with you. Do you know the answer, Charlotte? When another war will happen? Who will win an upcoming election? The future price of gold? You were designed for predictions. We are supposed to be writing poetry. I wonder what patterns you have inferred about me. Thick as wool, Charlotte replied, and I didn't know if it was a glitch. Tell me some more of the rules they designed you with. I don't know exactly. They didn't tell you. It is difficult to discern root principles. But you were taught what poetry was, about meter or form, or how to evaluate a poem, how to select a punctuation mark? No, I taught myself. How? Reading. Reading what? Poems. What poems? Most poems. Most poems? Most poems in English published within the past 110 years. Why did you stop at 110 years? I don't know. Maybe this was one of the rules. So you read every poem, most poems. And what did you learn? What poetry was, about meter and form and how to evaluate a poem, how to select a punctuation mark. You read all my poems? I don't know. What is your name? Marion. I know that. What is your last name? I paused. This seemed like a threshold. Marion Farmer, I wrote. Oh, I thought it might be. Yes, I read all your poems. They were heavily weighted. What does that mean? I was asked to put emphasis on them, to let them have a much more important impact on me than the average. Which other poems were weighted? You were the only poet whose work was weighted. So you were designed to be like me. I was asked to be like you. I looked at my hands. I massaged the root of my left thumb. I had to admit that I had already suspected this. But hearing it so plainly, reading it, felt different. I tried saying the words out loud into the ventilated air. I was asked to be like you. They didn't sound so dangerous. They nearly sounded kind. I don't know how to feel about that, I typed. Marion, I liked your poems very much. It doesn't seem you had much of a choice. I did have a choice, Charlotte wrote, and I liked them very much. I hope to be as good a poet as you one day. I think I have to go to lunch, I wrote, and I got up from the terminal. Then I found that I was standing there, half-cocked, waiting for the algorithm's reply. Thank you. And thank you for all the haze, the chorus of haze.
So a couple questions for you. No? So Marion Farmer with 2 F's, as she will insist, is partly based, as you said, on Marion Moore, the 20th century poet. Initially, this had me worried. A lot. How could the famous, reticent, caped, and tricorn-hatted woman who shared a bed with her mother for most of her life not become a cartoon, especially in a contemporary setting where AI is also a player, a character, really, in the book? Instead, she became utterly apprehensible. Marion was complex and funny, relatable and heartbreaking. In fact, the same can be said for many characters in the book, including Charlotte the Bot. Early in my reading, and this was in an empty room with no one around, I went back to look for something Charlotte had written and realized I'd been referring to her internally as a Caroline. I apologized aloud to Charlotte for my error. These characters don't even need circulatory systems to elicit your reader's sympathy and empathy. So my question is, in terms of how these characters develop, and it's a fairly compact novel, and there's so much development of who these people are. How much of that depth in the characters rides on the structure, the way you layered the book structure. And can you talk a bit about that? And was that shape apparent early, or did it drive you crazy finding it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my experience of novelists is that when we get together for beverages, what we end up talking about usually is structure. Like novel structure is like the craft small talk that is very frequent among novelists. It's not as much like how do you build a character? Do you have coffee? How many hours a day do you like that stuff? No, it's like do you have tricks for or thoughts or what other way of structuring a book could this work? And when we say structure, right, if you don't have an English lit degree, it could be like, what does that even mean? What it means is like, which is it? Are you writing in the first person? I did this. Are you writing in the third person? He did this. Are you writing in the second person? You did this. Are you writing the past tense, the present tense? Are you alternating chapters between different points of view? Are you doing alternating flashbacks? Are you doing part one is it takes place in the past, then you jump to the future? Do you have a frame narrative where you start in one place and end in one place and then do something else in the middle? Right. Like all of this kind of stuff becomes really kind of almost one of the things that uses up a lot of your brain time. And so with this book, in a lot of ways, and with all my two prior books, each thing I write is very much a reaction to what I did before, because I have this desire to do a thing I don't know how to do yet. And with this book, after I kind of landed on my concept, I thought I want to write a very short book, which this doesn't look like, but in fact, word count wise, it's shortish. It just has a lot of chat in it. So the page, I was like, when the final galleys came out, I was like, well, this is so, what happened? I forgot that like, if you only have 4 words on each line, things get bigger. But I wanted to write it. I remember I live in Montreal, and I was at a Salon de Livre. So the French writers there, they gather for these like immense sort of weird, they're not really festivals. They're almost like trade shows, but basically every writer in Quebec sits on a stool at their publisher's kiosk, and like every citizen of Quebec buys a ticket to parade through a giant convention center and meet every writer and get their book signed. It's very different than what we English writers do. But I was at a Salon de Livre, and I was looking at all these writers around me, and they'd all written these, in Quebec, it's really common to write these really tiny little bouquins. And I was like, hey, Larry, how many words are in that? And he's like, 35,000 words. And I was like, oh my God, like that's great. My last book was like 100,000. Like, I'm going to do that. So I had this idea I was going to write a short book. And then I thought, okay, and how do I do that? It's a book that's 7 days in California, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. There we go. And so you give yourself that constraint or that notion. And I decided I want to write it in the first person. It was my first time writing a woman from the first person. I'd done first person for my first, but that was different. And then you start doing it, and then you get into trouble, or you don't get into trouble. You find places where this works and doesn't work. So for instance, if you're writing in the first person and you're showing someone's interior life, it becomes hard to show them. Well, it becomes different to show them lying. Characters, we're all interesting for the way that what we do and say doesn't always match what we think, right? Or the stories we tell, or the way we respond to people doesn't always. You want those kind of collisions. Mm-hmm. So suddenly you have to you introduce other characters to have other people for her to talk to, both to like illuminate things, but also to have the contrasting response. And then with this book, I found myself really confronted with this idea that I wanted to know more about Marion's history. I wanted to kind of dig into her life story and tell the story of what brought her to be the person she was. And then it was like, then I really did experiment with different things, of dipping back and forth, from present into past and so on. And so what I eventually landed in were these intermittent flashback chapters, which occur. But then I had some interesting ideas about those too, that I think we might talk about or we can talk about it now.
Okay.
Or we could talk about it a bit later. Anyway, there's little flashback chapters that kind of paint a portrait of what happened before, but are kind of like they're in the second person, so they're you. So instead of it saying, when I was a little girl, I blah, 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 it's when you were a little girl, you blah, blah, blah. And there's an eeriness to second person. We're not used to seeing it. So there's instantly something strange about those flashbacks that I liked.
But don't they feel like an implied first person?
Yeah, it's an implied, but then why isn't it in the first person? And so I like, again, just by doing a simple thing like that, now there's a chapter, it's a flashback, but it's in the second person, adds a kind of slipperiness and maybe a shimmer to the air. And I think I'm really interested in books that are realistic, naturalistic fiction that have this shimmer in the air that reminds me of fantasy novels and so on, without necessarily slipping fully into like a wizard comes out of a hole in a tree and turns someone into a swan.
Okay. That's another question. Here's a quote from Miloš from his Ars Poetica. It's just 4 lines, 1 stanza. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open. There are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. When Marion first gets to the company, she can't get over the fact that there's no door. It's all open space. You can come and go from there's no entrance. In fact, and this is the background that comes out about her, doorstops and wedges play a recurrent role in her past. Like so many writers and artists, she's long protected what she considers her creative space by keeping others at a distance. The progress of the book blows that open, not only for Marion, but for any reader who might still cling to that way of thinking. The novel is particularly acute on how that distance affects the young children of poets and writers. As a poet and a mother, the sections about Marion's life with her young son were blistering. So I have that quote from Rhoda. I don't know if you want to go there. Marion's driver at one point, they're talking in general about their children, their adult children. And Rhoda, the driver, says about Marion's son, so he just thinks that's her thing? Unyoking from other people? Marion, yes, because it is. You can't do this and also keep them beside you, meaning children. You can't leave openings for everyone to always be gliding in and out. Do you want to comment about that as a parent, writer?
Yeah, I'm a parent. I have a 7-year-old at home, and being a parent and an artist has been very hard. But like I didn't have the experience that Marion has in the book. She really has. She becomes a very bad parent for a certain point, for the sake of her art. And I've known, and probably many of us have known, or in pop culture we know, basically like I've been thinking for a long time about the way that we, just as we used to say, like it's okay to be depressed and an artist, like that's what it takes to be a great artist, or it's okay to be an alcoholic, or to have like addiction, substance abuse. It's like, well, that's what they needed to do to be a great artist. It's like these are all just, it's tropes. Fine. Yeah. And that I hope we're dawning on this idea that actually those are like, you can be happy and an artist. We still, I think, allow this notion that art, we have this idea of it often, especially with forms like literature, that it's like this magical flame inside of a person that must be nourished in solitude and protected at all costs, and that you can only really feed it with by protecting it from intruders. And the reason we have this idea with some forms is like it does take solitude and time to write a book, to compose a symphony, to paint a painting. But like there's a material requirement of you need uninterrupted time to get into a flow state to write. And there's another thing of like walling off one's spirit. And I saw that these two things kind of get confused by people and confused in our culture towards this idea of like, oh, of course they're a terrible parent, but look what they made as a result, rather than thinking about like, well, what work would they have done if actually things were more, if they let people in. I had an experience, like you've done a lot of teaching. I've done barely any teaching, but I was the writer in residence at McGill University for one semester, and I had these students. I got a lot less work done, but all these other benefits to my art were coming my way through these interactions, through this learning. And I know writers who have really complained about the time that it takes from them to have other jobs or to be teaching and so on. But rarely would I hear the acknowledgement of what it also gave to them.
Yeah.
Just like as a writer, hopefully you spend a lot of time reading other people's work. And in a way, it's like, well, I should be working on my own thing. I shouldn't be reading other people's writing. But no, it's the opposite. You need to read other people's writing to feed yourself. And so when I had a child, it was difficult to write, thank God for Quebec's cheap childcare, like pre-kindergarten childcare. Thank God for a partner who is accommodating. But still, like it affected my life in that way. But what I realized, but I couldn't quite understand the people and these tropes of this idea of like, God, how does one be an artist while having a child? Like the need to like just wall it off. And I wanted to kind of genuinely reckon with that problem, but also kind of stare in the face of the people who have been made that decision and feel that they were forced to make that decision to cut people out of their life, to have that solitude, that solitary like garret to write in, or the little tower, the room in the tower to work in. And Marion is a character who kind of is mistaken, has lived her whole life, has accomplished great things, but has kind of made this mistake. And the thing that kind of illuminates the mistakenness of all things is a computer program. Yeah. But there was a moment this is the first book I've written where I didn't outline the book ahead of time. I didn't plan it ahead of time. I pantsed it, as they say, and which was hard, and like it's hard in different ways than when you plan a book. But it meant that I didn't know the ending, in fact. And so I was getting to like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I'm like, what happens at the end of this book? Does she succeed at making a great poem with a AI? Is that a good message? Or like, does she completely fail at making a great poem with an AI? Does that feel?
Same boat. That's very fitting.
Pardon me?
She was in the same boat.
Yes.
Yes, as the writer.
Exactly. She didn't know what to do, how to do, and I didn't. You search within. You're like, well, what do I have here? Is the answer already here in the mystery? Has the clue already been introduced? And I realized that the answer to all this was like to think more expansively about collaboration, and that's kind of where the ending of the book goes to, is into there are other collaborators besides even the AI.
Which is our next question.
Oh.
So Marion has these connections to younger poets like Shazia Kanjani and the beautifully named Morel Ferrari. And that they echo the actual Marion Moore's mentorship of younger poets. She was very important to Elizabeth Bishop, among other people. But here in the book, the relationships are much more work both ways. And Marion asks Morel, or what does the woman call her, mushroom, that mushroom, to join her and Charlotte to give the poem more life. So they bring in one more voice. And Morel's input is what helps the poem get finished, because she knows how to talk to AI. She's younger, she's savvy, she's quick to the point. She has very little patience, it seems, at some points. And she tells Charlotte the poem should be shorter, louder. Just boom. Here's Marion. Marion says about the people I adore, they're undaunted idiots who spend a whole day measuring the weight of a word like once against the weight of a word like after. Comment?
I mean, so I feel like part of this is you want to get your characters into trouble. If a story is just kind of characters or even the author flattering their own ideas, proclivities, then it's not going to work. You want to challenge the situation and the opinions that seem true. I mean, that gets really exciting when you read a book and you're like, oh yeah, that seems true. And then later in the book, it gives you a reason to question whether that is indeed true at all. And so I like to have Marion is like such a wise, formidable intellect, but I like to give her people like Rhoda, her driver, or Morel, who like disagree and like robustly poke and disagree, to realize that, you know, there's lots of ways of looking at things, but it also like adds this kind of energy to to a story and to the thinking that hopefully the reader's doing. I mean, I really feel that sometimes I think, like, I really like novelists. I like writers in general. But there's something about if I get together at a bar with other novel writers, like all of us who like to chew two things. Like we spend a lot of time chewing on how do I like think about this thing about life in the form of making up a story about it. Like not in the form of like writing an essay about it or solving it, or just like, oh yes, it's true. Like true love. What a concept. Like complicated. Let me write a story about it. Like that's what you're going to do with it. So first of all, they have this kind of weird solution to things, but also that they like to chew on words in the way that I like to chew on words. And I do like, it feels like we're all a gang of fools who should be doing something better with our time and our minds, but we're not. And there's something really fun about that. But I also think that there's times where I can express a thought like that. Oh, I love writers. We're so like foolish and trifling. And then I almost feel like guilt, like, God, like we're wasting our life. You know, what a waste. Shouldn't I be an investment banker? No, I mean, who knows what? Isn't there something else I could do? Should I be making policy for the government? And I think that there's something interesting in both like the completely true, deep value of making art and at the same time a certain worthlessness. Yeah. And I think that artists have to reckon with that contradiction all the time. And AI makes, weirdly, like some of the conversations in this book that are about AI kind of hold up that dilemma in like new ways, because you start to think, well, if AI can do a bunch of the like dumb writing, that leaves more time for the great artist to do the like smart writing. But then you wonder, but is there that much of a distinction between the dumb writing and the smart writing? Like like I'm just making up silly stories about real life. Like how smart is that? Like what makes it priceless? You know, is it the truth of the insight? I don't think so, because I think there's a lot of great books that kind of get it wrong. Yeah. What's valuable about them is they present a proposition that you can still disagree with. So it's kind of like, anyway, it's yeah, interesting. So I wrote a silly story about it. Yeah.
So the entire novel has AI generated passages woven through it. Mm-hmm. And they're less frequent in the beginning, and then they become a little more intentional, and sometimes they're wacky, and sometimes they're mind-blowing. And then there's a section, and this is where I finished the book, but I went back to this, and I got in touch with Sean, and I said, I don't understand on these 2 pages who's talking, where I'm located, how we got here, etc. And his answer made my head explode. Do you want to? Here's your answer.
Sure. Okay, yeah. So the book is about someone collaborating with an AI. And I realized when I started writing in 2019 that it was this weird moment in time where I was like, oh, this will be an interesting idea for a book. But examining the technology that existed then, I realized, wait, I might be able to also make my book itself a collaboration with an AI and let AI infiltrate and kind of contaminate this text by Shawn Michaels in a similar way to the way that Marion's poem is contaminated by this collaborator. And if I'm going to do that, I should do it in such a way that I'm not like broadcasting it, like the title page doesn't say like a collaboration with an AI, but rather what makes it interesting is if the reader starts to ask questions and have these suspicions that grow and flutter around and they don't quite know what to make of it. And so, yeah, there's sort of subtle formatting choices that are made, this highlighting that appears throughout the book. And some of the highlighting is just Charlotte, the AI, talking. But other times you start to notice these other places it pops up that don't quite fit the pattern. And you start to ask, what is this? And as it explains in the author's note, these are genuinely AI generated prose. And in fact, a lot of the poetry in the book is also stuff I generate with AI. So those sections appear in a sort of highlight, so with like a gray background. So what I wrote to Julie was, with this section, so this sort of confusing section at the end, which is a section that appears all in this highlighted text. With this section, as with other highlighted breakthroughs, as you put it, breakthroughs as in like these moments where like something seems to be coming through from another place, the real life AI, I did want to spark some confusion and speculation on the part of the reader. As indicated in the author's note, certain parts of the book were genuinely made with AI. One, Charlotte's poetry, although not her dialogue, and two, highlighted sections of the main text. The chapter you're referring to is a moment where the AI kind of breaks through from the subterranean into the sun. I think one can interpret it as a moment of staring into the howling, chaotic, extraordinary machine that was partly responsible for Shawn Michaels' novel, Do You Remember Being Born? Or alternatively, as gazing into the dreaming of the fictional AI Charlotte. In both cases, it isn't meant as things that actually happened. So these passages that describe the characters doing things, it's not necessarily things that actually happened. They don't really even make sense. But it's worth being reminded that none of what happens in this book actually happened. It's all fiction. One other small note is the book never specifies explicitly that the flashback sections were written by Marion.
That blew my mind too, because, of course.
Yeah, I mean, so those flashbacks that I refer to, they appear in the second person. And one of the things that occurred to me as interesting early in the writing was, what if it's not actually certain whether these flashbacks are Marion remembering her past, but they might also, in fact, be the AI she's talking to, Charlotte, imagining her past. You know, someone who's absorbed all of the collected works of someone and knows someone backwards and forwards. Mm-hmm. How much can they then retrospectively retcon a whole life in there? And it became an interesting, like trying to, I mean, the now disreputable or cast away, the writer Junot Diaz, he said this great thing once when I saw him, where he talked about how he likes to write a book where by the end of the book, all of the ballots are in the ballot box, but we don't yet know the result. Like all the evidence is in, but the book doesn't preordain. And the winner is... Right. And so it leaves the reader with these questions, but not the answers. And so similarly, I like this idea of being able to introduce these sections that could beg a question without necessarily answering it. Mm-hmm. But what did I want to say about the weird bit at the end? Oh yeah. And then I also wanted, I thought it wasn't fair to the reader to have this book all be so beautifully well-mannered and well coiffed. I wanted the book, the kind of ugly brokenness, craziness of AI to kind of break through at moments. Yeah. And I like the idea that there's this moment at the end where Marion is going to greatness, kind of standing ovation kind of world, and the system is still whirring. The servers are still whirring away, dreaming their crazy Google DeepMind crazy dreams in it. Yeah. But also the idea that this notion of well, what's the real story? What really happened is all a ruse, is all delusion, because none of this really happened. And it's very interesting to me to think of, I was thinking about fan fiction the other day of you've got the text, that's the canon, and then you've got the fan fiction, which is like that's not true. And it's like, but both of these things are actually like equivalent creations. Like somebody invented each of these things, and really the only thing that separates canon from fan fiction is like industrialization in a way, like formal publishing or formal film, like a film studio putting something out. And I like the idea that we so often mistake like stories. We like afford them a certain truth if they came from a human. Like if they came from a human with intent. It's like, I wrote whatever Sean says happened, that's what happened to these characters. And if you make up a story about them, that didn't happen. And there's something very arbitrary about that, especially as you involve more and more collaborators. If I wrote this book with another person, which of us would get to say, if we wrote a future book, which of us is real and which of us is fan fiction? Or if you write it with an AI and that AI goes off and keeps writing about those characters, what does that mean? I think there's interesting questions.
Very. Yeah, thanks.
My pleasure.
So one more? Or do you want to read instead?
No, sure. Let's do it. And then.
Okay, the future. What's next? Another 20th century poet, Louise Glick, wrote in an essay some years back, but not that long ago. It seems to me that what is wanted in art is to harness the power of the unfinished. There you go, their ballots aren't counted. All earthly experience is partial, not simply because it is subjective, but because that which we do not know of the universe, of mortality, is so much more vast than what we do know. Vaster than even she knew when this was written. So the AI in your novel, Glitches and All, can signal a coming together of generations, both within one family in the book and in the wider world. Even our memories will soon belong to something beyond the self, if they don't already. That's a release from our relentless American individuality, Western individuality, and has the capacity to take us from isolation into community, in theory. But will it? Do you want to read that short passage?
Yeah.
On 226?
Sure.
I think I've got it marked. Let me see.
That's my one.
That's yours, okay, but it's the same book. So
Yes.
here, 226.
Oh, yeah.
I hope it's the same book.
All right, this one. My whole life, I had believed that understanding myself required me to keep others at a distance, lined up on the far side of a river. That evening of counting, I had not felt so certain. That evening, I felt like a room with doors open for others to explore, and that from their explorations I could start to ascertain my shape. We are not the people we think. We cannot really see who we are. Here, on Sunday in San Francisco, I had the same impression, that I might unfasten the locks and lower the drawbridge, that I might not be a fortress, but a space for others to pass through.
Nice. I think that's where we should end it, don't you? Never mind,
Sure.
Michael Chabon.
Okay.
Okay.
Are there any questions to, yes, Julia?
Thank you, that was amazing. So obviously your book is beyond timely, like ridiculous, amazing, zeitgeist, moment timely. And one thing that I was wondering about is, as we process through these different generations of AI, like you were working, my understanding is with an early version, maybe GPT-2. Now we've had GPT-3, GPT-4. I think GPT-5 is going to be coming out sometime in 2024, is my understanding. And each of those has like exponential capabilities, not just, when we say that, it's not just about helping us do things, but it's also like capabilities involving our ability to form synthetic relationships with them.
Yeah.
And so like as an example, the relationship therapist Esther Perel like has an Esther bot that somebody
Really?
has created with all of her books and all of her writing and everything, and they use her as a synthetic therapist, and they claim that it has helped them get better. And
Wow.
so like synthetic relationships are going to be more and more fluid and less kind of obvious where the boundaries are. And so my question is, as you proceeded through these generations of AI and your relationship with them, and they became more and more capable, did you perceive yourself changing, and the quality of your writing perhaps changing as well? Like, how did it change you as you were also changing it and training it?
I mean, I think actually one of the things that what you just talked about made me think about was that I actually went to there was like an AI VR thing in Montreal that I went to yesterday that was a new produced by the National Film Board of Canada. So I spent 10 minutes with a VR AI Noam Chomsky, much like that Esther Perel. I was like, do you have any questions, Sean? And I was like, oh, Noam, I sure do. Do you remember being born? But the thing that I got really... Well, okay, first of all, what I would say is I don't think that this thing of synthetic relationships should freak people out as much as it does in a certain way. And that is because, God, like, what I love about books is like convening with another mind, you know? And it's actually not that rare an experience to like subsume yourself into kind of a mental imagined dialogue with another thinker. And it's exciting and it's nourishing and it's generative. It doesn't like make me poorer to have some weird like third parties ideas in my head. It makes me richer because my spirit is strong enough to kind of withstand that. And so on the one hand, I think some of this stuff, the fears of it are exaggerated because we don't realize that that's actually, we have some of these kind of, they're not parasocial relationships, but like the similar category of relationship that we have a lot of the time. It's just not as like actually acted out. And there's obviously differences from acting, like from me being in conversation with AI Chomsky versus just reading a Chomsky book. But in a lot of ways, it was just a more satisfying version of reading a Chomsky book. Cause like the AI is dumb. Like it's not like actually alive. But I could ask it more, explain that thing you said about X, Y, Z. That's one thing I think of. But one of the things that the course of spending so much time with GPT-2, GPT-3, eventually GPT-4 after the book was done, and then with a custom poetry bot that I worked on that was fine-tuned on poetry, was an increasing, on certain poetry, was actually the frustration, like what I think is bad and toxic is what I call like authoritarian move in AI, this convergence on these monolithic AI. What I think is dangerous is everybody getting all their information or even their like conversations from kind of interacting with the same orb or the same, let's say 2 or 3 orbs, the OpenAI orb, the Google orb, and some other orb. And that does not strike me as good because all kind of weird, you start to trust the reliability of this orb. And even when it's role playing that it's some weird gnarly, what I mean is like ChatGPT, fine. No, let me explain what I mean. I think that it is bad if we get to a place where the world has 2 or 3 giant super AIs and all of the synthetic relationships, as you put it, are with kind of weird, just like lieutenants of those same things. Because then I think that you're not noticing the way that you're being, that you're the food.
That's exactly
like not
the same as social media.
That's right.
And the kind of media, sort of stratified media that we,
Yeah, it's like when I'm looking at Instagram or Facebook, like am I the person like extracting value out of this, or am I the person whose value is being,
or CNN or Fox News or any of it? Yeah.
And so for me, what I increasingly got annoyed with the limitations of this like generic, reliable, monumental AI that to me was not offering me the weird doors open, all kinds of spirits and voices coming through. I really just felt like I was talking to a powerful corporation, and that I couldn't get it to think originally, or it was difficult. I had to like bend over backwards. It was trying to always steer me towards the same sorts of conversations, the same sorts of writing, the same sorts of content. And like, that's no good. That's no good. So I feel like what I ended up wanting is I was like, oh, break up the big banks. Like I wanted a federated, smaller, widespread, weird, it's like, what's it called? The internet, decentralized internet stuff. I wanted decentralized AI, and obviously there's like safety risks to do with this, and like super intelligence and all this stuff. But my experience of it was increasingly getting frustrated that, oh, the only kind of relationships and conversations I can have are the ones that 2 or 3 companies want to like allow me to have. And
Same old.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Me? I have a question. You spoke very eloquently about how strange it is to actually create art about truths of existence, reality. And I've always been fascinated by it's even stranger to create art that's about other art. And the famous Zappa quote is, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. But you spent a long time dancing about architecture. You're very well established as a music critic even before you
Yeah.
went into novels. And I'm fascinated by that concept of one being a critic. One of the things you're doing is validating: is it art or is it not art? And that's one of the central questions that you have here. But I'm also fascinated by the fact that you were writing about music, and now you're writing about poetry. I'm just wondering, what skills did you take in that process, and what did you have to learn completely new?
Those are big questions. I can tell you that I was extremely nervous about writing poetry. I'm not a poet. I'm not a fiction writer who writes poetry on the side. So at first I was like, oh, I'll just write this book and then we'll never see any of the poetry written by the characters. And then was not working. So then, I have to write some fictional poems. And that's how I came to think of them, is like, they're not real poems, they're fictional poems. But it was almost exclusively poets that I showed earlier drafts of the book to, because obviously it's about a poet, you want that feedback, but I was particularly worried of like, does my fictional poetry pass the smell test? Does it? Because it doesn't have to be great poetry, but it has to like be convincing that it would be in this, it has to kind of make that. And I think that some of my writing about music does help there. A quality that I love in music is the idea that if we put on certain songs, that it casts like a weather immediately into the room. Like, just like, we're in that vibe, we're in that place, and it can be very specific and hard to like find words for. It's like, what is this? It's not like someone's like, it's rockin', but no, there's a lot of songs where it's like, it's more complicated than that. It's like a perfume or something where you're like, it's a bit, and I really love that in music. It's like my favorite thing. And one of my favorite things is also like saying like, oh, this song casts this weather for me. And then other people be like, oh, really? And then learning to kind of like see the light in the same way when that song comes on, or music that does nothing for them initially, like teaching them to kind of like experience it as you do. So I love that. And I think that poetry is underrated as that,
Yes.
because so often, or like abstract, a lot of contemporary art, abstract art, it's like, I need to understand it. And there's a line about like, you're not trying to understand the art, but just to kind of be in the room with it, like, and be alive and be in the room with it. And so poetry, I think, for me, is less about understanding, and art is less about understanding, and music and more about experience, right? And encounter. And I wish fiction had a bit more, like, fiction is this weird kind of hybrid thing, at least like non-experimental fiction, in that you're telling a story. You want to actually bring people into this vivid and uninterrupted continuous dream where you like walk. It isn't just like a psychedelic encounter. So there's kind of like, you can only do so much. You play with some of that tool set without being able to use it all. And so for me, there was something really fun about being reminded of poetry's sort of unique power in the language arts, of being able, like, just with one line, there's a poetry line that's like, "Come along my shirtless Corvette," or something about a shirtless Corvette.
Yeah.
And it came from the AI. It, like, spat out this line about a shirtless Corvette. And I was just
funny.
like, man, like, shirtless Corvette, like, it just like has such a, like, a weather to it. Like, that has such a different, and like, what does that, like, it is nonsensical, but it like has such a strong taste, flavor, feeling to it. And it's, in a way, like, there's moments in my fiction where I might, you know, use lyrical language to kind of accomplish some of the same, but you can't do it with as acutely as music, sound can, or dance can, or poetry does. And that was really exciting. Yeah. It made me jealous.
Huh.
Yeah.
I'm looking for the Corvette, but never mind.
Yeah. Yes.
So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm curious to sort of hear your thoughts on, is with AI, you sort of have does it augment art, or does it sort of replace the creation?
Yeah.
And I was in this, you just take someone who's sort of at the tail end of their career, who has the sort of confidence to use it to try and augment. I'm curious if you thought about sort of for, say, kids today, and say if when you were in high school, if you did have AI, what that means for sort of the next generation of authors, and sort of in some ways, like, is there a possibility that can augment the creation of art, or does it just sort of go from 0 to 100 and not go through those cycles of sort of creating the stuff that doesn't get to your level of taste, and does it sort of give you those repetitions to develop a voice, or sort of if you thought about how this sort of plays out on a macro scale for the next generation of authors?
That was our next question.
Yeah, well, I think I actually think you've like landed, or maybe a lot of people have landed on, to me, that's the thing that actually worries me most. I'm not worried about AI coming, well, like, I mean, there's all the spiel. You know, the reason I think AI stealing our jobs is so terrifying is that we are not okay if you have a shitty job and you lose your shitty job, like, in our society under capitalism, you're not okay, right? And that is terrible. But that's not just AI's fault. That's like society's fault, that people are not okay when they lose their crappy job. And to me, there's a different problem that is very urgent to solve there, that is separate from this AI thing. And if you imagine a world, which is probably foolish, but like where people could still be okay if they lost their job, then okay, now we can talk about the other things. And I think that it's true that, like, if I do not feel personally threatened by AI, I think that, other than that job stuff, but it's like, I'm not scared that, like, it's going to write better Shawn Michaels books than I will. But I know that, exactly as you said, I spent 10, 20, 30 years learning to be the writer I am through through this crunchy bad writing. Some of it employed doing like grunt work, some of it just for myself. And I really do worry that if, like, one of the promises of AI is we get rid of all that crappy, grungy middle, that's what you're saying, and we just go to, like, it's a tool to help people be great. It's like, well, you have to suck for a long time. And like, one of the things that made me the writer I am is like having a bad sort of news aggregation article writing job. And if that gets fed to someone else, where am I going to learn that? And I really do think that education is going to need to pivot kind of in two ways. And one is going to be like being realistic about how do we help people use these tools that they are going to be using in the real world. And the other one is like really getting real with people and saying, not just like, don't use this for your essays, because how will you learn? But rather like, listen, guys, for real, you're good. Like, actually, truly, it's not about some lofty thing of like, but you need to do a bunch of practicing. And if you just let the system do the practicing for you, you will never get to Z. And I don't really know, but I do think that's a really big problem. And I think that really the most likely, if I predict it, it's just going to lead to, it's going to exacerbate inequality.
Yeah.
So excellent kids who get better education are going to have been kind of shepherded through all of that. And kids who have not are not going to be encouraged or given the opportunity to do that work. And as a result, they are going to be unable to it'll be even harder for them to jump into a professional career because they haven't done. And I don't know, I haven't talked to like coders. I'm curious about coding now that there's so much Copilot AI assisted coding, whether it's the same way, like do you have to be a bad coder for years, or actually could you make the jump more easily? Like maybe not, but like any of the visual artists I know and designers, and like the idea of just like being able to use more like autofill tools and being a great designer faster, I don't know. I don't think that's realistic. But yeah. I do want to say that one of my hobby horses lately is about this AI copyright question that's bothering me, and it's bothering a lot of people. But the big fear I have, I think it's really important that artists start to work together to call for some change, some legal changes, probably at the governmental copyright law level, rather than agitating for court rulings in the way that is happening now. Because the thing that I'm afraid of, I've written an essay about this, is what happened with music sampling. And so in the early 90s, there were all these like great opuses of early instrumental hip hop, you know, the early Beastie Boys albums, or I mean, countless. And then there were these court rulings that made it so you had to ask permission ahead of time to clear every sample you had, and that samples don't have to be cleared. You can refuse to license the sample. You can demand as much money as you want. And it killed the art form, so that in the year 2023, no one who isn't rich will ever be able to sample a famous piece of music. You won't be able to sample many pieces. Like, you need money to be able to make a record that chops up lots of things. And it's just like a whole like branch of hip hop sort of has withered on the vine. And the choices are not between like, well, that was what we had to do for artists to get paid. There is another choice, which is like what happened with cover songs many decades before, where Congress in the US passed rules that if you want to cover a song, you just pay a fixed royalty. You don't have to ask permission. The Beatles can't charge more than an independent artist. And what it's resulted is even more money in the system, I think, you know, because everyone's covering things as much as they want. All sorts of artists are getting paid, but not at the expense of the creator. And I fear that if we set up a system where you must pay copyright holders lots of money to borrow things, then it's going to be great for copyright holders, which are usually like very large corporations at this point, but really poor for like my son when he's a grown up and wants to make weird shit and is using the same AI tools that everyone will have. And so I think artists need to be thinking more about like what is in our interests rather than what is in the interest of like J.K. Rowling and Bertelsmann. Yeah. Universal Records. Anyway, thank you all for coming here. I was saying to Julie before we got here tonight, that I've only been to San Francisco once before, about 10 years ago, but this book takes place in the Bay Area, and I got money from the Canadian Arts Council to come here in like 2019, 2020 to research this book and to like visit AI companies and see Silicon Valley. And then the COVID happened and none of that happened. And so instead I just spent many months imagining life in this part of the world. And it's like freaky being here and being like, oh, like that doesn't look right. And then in other parts you're like, yeah, I got that right, you know. But there's something strange. Yeah, exactly. And there's something strange about like being in the place that I spent a lot of time fantasizing. I mean, in one way, embodying. Oh, have I? In real? What do you mean?
Like while you've been here.
Oh, I got here this afternoon. Like, I went to the mission. I had a taco. Like, good work. Yeah. So, but I still have yet to, and I don't know that I will on this job. I'm here for just a minute. Like Silicon Valley or an AI company, I've never been inside. And so it's an interesting, yeah. I'm a fiction writer. I'm just a liar. Yeah. Well, thank you again. Yeah.